Homeowners in England and Wales who have bought their houses leasehold may in future be able to buy the freehold at a fraction of the current cost. The proposals were published by the Law Commission this week. Leaseholders just buy the right to live in a house or flat for maybe 99 years, while a freeholder actually owns the building, and that can lead to problems and expense. Tony Bonsignore is here. Tony.
It was in December last year, Paul, that the government announced it was planning big changes to the leasehold market. Now, that was in response to a growing scandal over leasehold houses sold with clauses that saw ground rents double every 10 years, making them almost impossible to sell. Well, as part of that review, the government asked the Law Commission to look at the legal process of extending a lease or buying a freehold, also known as enfranchisement. It wanted ways of making the process easier, faster and cheaper. Katie Cohen is a solicitor at Keystone who specialises in enfranchisement. She says the current system is neither easy, fast nor cheap.
It involves obtaining a specialist valuation. It involves drafting the notice and serving it upon your freeholder. It involves a negotiation, not just in terms of the premium that's payable for that freehold, but also in respect of the transfer document. And then it involves time waiting for that to be registered. There's always a negotiation, and generally there is always a disagreement.
The Law Commission now proposes to sweep away much of this complexity. One proposal is to cap the amount a leaseholder might have to pay to buy their freehold, but that proposal is likely to prove controversial. Landlords, for example, may challenge such a move on the grounds that it would deprive them of their legal assets. Damien Greenish is a consultant solicitor at Pemberton Greenish. His firm represents some of the country's biggest freeholders, including public sector and private property investors.
I think there would be challenges to that. I think there would be challenges under human rights legislation because landlord would say that they're not being properly compensated for their legitimate interests in a property.
But leasehold campaigners see it rather differently. Louis Burns is from Leasehold Solutions, which advises leaseholders on their rights.
Our main concern is the amount of weight that's given to the freeholders' human rights in the document. For many centuries, the leaseholders have had no rights and they have paid more money than they should have to freeholders. Yet the document gives an awful lot of weight to their rights. And we think it's high time that it's the human rights of leaseholders that should be considered now.
Louis Burns ending Tony's introduction there. Well, let's go live now to Southampton to talk to Professor Nick Hopkins. He's the Law Commissioner who is in charge of this week's report. Professor Hopkins, how do people with leasehold houses now pay for the freehold if they want to do that?
Yes, well, at the moment, there are three elements that the leaseholder has to pay for. The first of those is the term. So the ground rent income the landlord would receive over the course of the lease is turned into a lump sum, and that's done using a capitalisation rate. Then secondly, there's a reversion. So the house would go back to the landlord at the end of the lease. The current value of that is calculated and a deferment rate is used to ascertain that. And then there's what's called marriage value. Now, marriage value recognises that the value of the freehold and leasehold held by the same person is more than their combined value if they're held by different people. So to give an example, if we each had a vase and those vases were worth £1,000 each, but as a pair they were worth £2,500, then the marriage value would be £500. Okay. And a relativity graph is used to ascertain the marriage value.
Sure. Well, we heard earlier that the procedure was complicated. Even that, how you work, what you have to work out is complicated as well. How would your proposal simplify it?
Well, what we've been asked to do by government in terms of the price people pay is provide options that will reduce the price but provide sufficient payment to the landlord. So what we set out in the paper we've published this week and that we will expand and consult upon in the paper in September are a range of options. They fall broadly into two categories. So one is to wipe the slate clean from the current law and provide a simple formula, such as the multiplier of ground rent that was discussed by Damien Greenish and Louis Burns. The other would be to use the current formula, But, for example, to fix all of the rates that are used within it, as it's determining those rates that causes a lot of litigation at the moment, or take marriage value out of the equation completely.
Yes, and we heard about the possible legal challenges. Either way, landlords are going to lose something, aren't they? And there could be challenges under the human rights laws.
As is often the case in human rights law, it's balancing the rights of the landlord against the rights of the leaseholder. Now, we know from previous challenges to enfranchisement legislation that enfranchisement is seen as a legitimate thing for governments to provide for. They have what human rights lawyers call a margin of appreciation within which they can operate. So it's not necessary to provide full market value. The question is how far away from that you can move before interfering with the landlord's rights.
Yeah, so because it's an important matter of public policy, they can, in a sense, override the human right over your property. That's as I understand it.
That's right, yes. They can interfere with rights to the extent that is necessary to achieve a public policy.
But a careful balance has anyway, I think. Now, this report on leasehold houses is part of a bigger look at leasehold reform that you're doing, including flats, which obviously is a larger number of people. What's your timetable?
We're working to a very ambitious timetable. So we will publish a full consultation paper for houses and flats in September. We'll hold a public consultation on that. And we will then publish our final recommendations for reform in the middle of next year.
And I know it's not down to you, but then it has to go through Parliament and the government has to decide what it's going to do. So we're not talking about a quick fix, are we?
Well, we think the issues here are so important that a quick fix isn't possible. We have 450 pages of legislation across 50 statutes to examine.
Right, well, good luck with that, Professor Nick Hopkins. Thanks very much. And these plans will affect the estimated 1.4 million leasehold houses that are already sold to people. The government has announced it will in future ban the sale of new houses leasehold, but there's no date for that to start. A spokesman told me this morning it would happen in due course.